Hey folks, Roland Martin of TV1, the Tom Joyner Morning Show, and you're listening to We Act Radio. Do something.
I want to start with you, Clint, because there were so many parallels that came to me when we were hearing the unraveling of the story. The fact that he was a young man that purposely got into his car and drove it to another city to cause maximum harm to a community of color. He left a manifesto. He wanted to. He got inspired and radicalized online. All of this seems to check the same box and the same lists as what happened in El Paso, tragically, almost 2.5 years ago. Can you talk about those parallels? And is the radicalization happening at such extreme cases online that it's spilling over into real life?
Yeah, that's right, Maria. If you look at the manifesto and you also look at what this individual did in Buffalo, he pulled strings from many different attacks before him, and his manifesto references many of the attacks that have come before him. In fact, there's a man named Tarrant, you might remember. He was an Australian who did a mosque attack and live streamed it in March of 2019. Many of the parts of his manifesto reference Tarrant. He's known in these online communities as Saint Tarrant. And instead of having a real ideology that they adhere to, they instead reference each other. Whoever has the most successful attack, they write a manifesto. That manifesto then is referenced by those that follow them as basically a playbook. Essentially what to do if you're going to undertake an attack. When you look at his social media footprint as well, from what we can tell, the accounts that track back to him, he'd been planning this in a community, an online community, for at least 2 months. And in that, he lays out very succinctly and very step-by-step details what he plans to do. I would also just reinforce that this is quite common in these online communities. One of the biggest barriers over the last 2 years, it has been the pandemic. Essentially, there wasn't enough targets. You know, there wasn't any way to do targeting or to even mobilize. I think that valve has come off. This is really concerning because these often create a contagion where there is some other white supremacist, racially motivated attacker around the world, and they see an attack like this. And this attack inspires them to essentially carry out another attack. I'm worried about the contagion effect, and I'm also worried about how difficult it is for law enforcement. As you said, he drove 200 miles. That's something similar that we saw to the El Paso attack. He used live streaming, which is very difficult to police online. That's something we've seen at least twice, and Tarrant did in the New Zealand mosque attack. There's a lot of indications out there, but it's hard to piece together and try and anticipate where these attacks might actually unfold at.
Roland, I think that this is something, sadly, that amongst our communities we often talk about. Is something that we don't say out loud, but behind closed curtains and within our dining room tables, we talk about the fear of the rise of white supremacy and targeting communities of color, African American, Latino, Asian. And what do you say now? Because oftentimes, Roland, people say, well, it wasn't really a hate crime, and they try to make it less than the blow than it actually was. This man had in his hands a gun that said, here are your reparations. What do you say? What do you say to folks that try to say that we're over qualifying the rise in hate in the United States?
This is not something that I have been quiet about. When I was on CNN in 2009, I remember John Avlon and I were off air ready to go on, and I said to John, we're living in the age of white minority resistance. And it was all after the election of President Barack Obama. And I've been getting on this from the rooftops for the last 13 years, and that's why I've been working on this book, White Fear, for the last 3 years. What we have to understand is that what you have in this country, you have people who are angry and afraid that America is changing. It's becoming more and more multicultural, and it's been there. You've got politicians, you've got Republicans talking about this whole replacement theory. You've got conservative radio, conservative bloggers, Fox News, literally making millions and billions off of this. They are purposely pushing the buttons of white rage. And so we have to understand that. The FBI director has talked about the greatest threat is domestic terrorism. It is white domestic terrorism. It's not some Muslim shooting up someplace. It is white people in this country that are angry and upset because the country that they have known that has been theirs is changing, and we need to understand this will not be the last time. And so this mass killing is on the far end of the spectrum, but how do you deal with individuals in political power who are literally saying the exact same thing that he said in his manifesto, and they are the ones who could be in charge after the midterm election? We cannot overlook this.
So, Clint, let's talk about that, because your expertise oftentimes is very much what happens in the closed web, how that people get radicalized. But Roland puts up a great point. We have members of the Republican Party that are talking about replacement theory in their political ads. We have a whole network that is dedicated to talking about the rise of a multicultural America that makes them feel uneasy and directly blasting it. When you talk about contagion, how do we control this? Under President Trump, he actually dismantled one of the units that was talked about, that was basically its whole focus was to counter white nationalism. What do we do when our leadership, sadly, seems to be part of the fire that we're experiencing right now?
When political leaders, elected leaders, media leaders start picking targets and start demonizing populations, you will see an uptick in violence, and you will see an uptick in individuals that move to violence. It's called stochastic terrorism. The idea is that you can't determine where any one single plot is going to be because it's mediated. It's put out over the media, over the airwaves. But there is target designation. We see this in terms of the language and the rhetoric used by different political groups. And in the online environment, I would tell you that the intensity of that is tenfold, particularly with the younger generation. When you hear FBI Director Wray go to these hearings, when he speaks at different places, he routinely emphasizes that the populations he's worried about in terms of terrorism are racially motivated terrorists. Those are white supremacists. And where do they emerge from? They emerge from the online communities. And why is it difficult to detect them? Because they're not operating in groups. These are young men, just like you see there in that footage, who are being radicalized and mobilized online. They coordinate together, they inspire each other, and in some cases, they actually form cells over time. This is the inverse of what we saw after 9/11. The American terrorist problem is about white supremacy. It is about online mobilization, and it's about access to weapons. We act like this is some sort of aberration. It is not. What was different between international terrorists and domestic terrorists over the last 20 years? International terrorists often don't have access to targets. They don't have access to the weapons. But who does? An 18-year-old here has access to weapons. An 18-year-old who was radicalized, what appears to be very recently based on his online postings over the last 2 years, he can quickly go out, gain those weapons, and do that legally. There is no screening mechanism. There's also reports already out this morning that this individual may have been known to law enforcement and may have made a separate threat about a potential mass shooting at a different time. So there's indicators out there, but we're not responding to it. If it was international terrorists, we absolutely would.
I think you'd underscore it.
Maria, I really want.
Go ahead, Roland. We have to go.
Really
jump in really briefly, please.
I really want us to understand that this is American history we're talking about. This has been going on for 400 years. The response to the rise of a minority group has evoked this response. Black people have experienced this terror for centuries. We need to understand that it's not just this new phenomenon, and so it is directly tied to the advancement of people, the fear that they're taking our jobs, they're taking our resources, they're taking our women, they're taking our money. We're not going to relinquish this power. We better understand this will not be the last time we're dealing with this here. This is white fear.
Clinton, Roland, I think what you guys are both talking about is very much the rise of a multicultural America. This is very much an experiment in democracy. We've never seen this on Earth. We recognize when we say a multicultural democracy, we're talking about 140 million Americans who are people of color. And so we are going to have to resolve it. We're going to have to resolve it together, and we're going to have more frank conversations, because what makes America so special is the fact that we are diverse. Clint Watson, Roland Martin, thank you so much for this, for the expertise on such a really sensitive, difficult topic.
Hey, folks, Roland Martin of TV One, the Tom Joyner Morning Show, and you're listening to We Act Radio. Do something.